Welcome, everyone, to the Over Under Movies podcast, a show where we take a prominent figure or franchise in the world of filmmaking and ask the simple question, is it overrated or is it underrated? My name is DeAngelis. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host. I don't have a fancy intro to use for this one, Jason. It's just Jason. You're just Jason for this podcast.
All right, that's fine.
Welcome aboard, Jason. Jason, today we are doing Mad Max, the OG film released in 1979. This film is shot entirely in Australia, very low budget. Mad Max Furiosa is coming out, next week? Or it's coming out the week that we're doing this podcast.
Yeah, soon.
So that's a sequel to, it's a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road. It's the most expensive film ever shot in Australia. So we thought it was only fitting to get a real-life Australian on the pod to talk about Mad Max with us today. So we want to welcome to the podcast Isobel, Rennie. Izzo, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great. Actually, we also have a surprise guest on the pod today. We thought it wouldn't be enough to just have one Australian on the pod. We actually have two. We have a second one live here in our studio. You want to come in real quick?
Hey, here. Use some dollary dues with some gasoline in the lorry.
Welcome, Patrick Fit to the podcast. Pat, pull up a chair.
True blue Aussie right there.
So like I said in the intro there, we're talking about Mad Max, 1979, directed by George Miller. It is the film that was like the breakout role for Mel Gibson. We'll talk about him. He plays the titular Mad Max in this film. Jason, somehow neither of us had ever seen the original Mad Max film. I have seen every other film in the Mad Max franchise except for the first one.
Wow.
And we watched it together this week. What were your thoughts on Mad Max?
Yeah, so I had only seen Fury Road, which I love like everyone else. That movie's awesome. I was pretty excited to see this because I know it's like a beloved movie, the start of like a massive and like growing franchise. I thought this movie was okay. I gave it 3 stars. I think it's a little slow. I think the pacing's kind of weird, but it's got a really cool aesthetic and like distinct look to it that is kind of like carried and then transformed over like the rest of the films until they get to Fury Road, which I have seen. So I think it does a good job kind of creating a world, and the world is like pretty fun to see and live in. So yeah, overall, it's fine.
Yeah, I think you gave it 3 stars. I gave it 2 stars on Letterboxd.
Yeah.
I actually thought that this movie was kind of hard to follow for a lot of it. It's so dissimilar to every other film in this franchise, interestingly enough. When most people think of like the quote-unquote Mad Max aesthetic, they think of Road Warrior, they think of Beyond Thunderdome, and then Mad Max Fury Road. They think of that like car chase out in the desert type aesthetic, goofy like, outfits and like flames and stuff like that. That's really not what this movie is. This movie is much more grounded. And part of the reason for that is because George Miller, he shot this on a $400,000 budget, largely self-financed between him and his producing partner. George Miller worked as a emergency room doctor to like make most of his money in his like early adulthood. He really wanted to be a filmmaker, though. He took like a summer like film school, and Mad Max was a script that he had been working on for a while. And he took it to like a production company. They said like, we're not going to pay for like, to make this entire film. So he went and made it himself. It went on to make $100 million internationally. It became the most like successful, like gross to budget film of all time for a solid like 20 plus years, which is absolutely absurd. And like I said in the intro, it's shot entirely in Australia. So I got to say, like, how Australian is this movie? Is it authentic to the Australian aesthetic?
Very. Yeah, I was like, you were making comments on the aesthetic of it. I'm like, the aesthetic is just Australia in the 70s. Like, that is actually what it looks like. It still kind of looks like that. Like, if you go to rural Australia, anytime it's like drought, it's really damp at the moment, so everything's a little too green. But yeah, if you go out during like the dry spell, it looks like that. All of the roads look like that. I'm fairly certain I've driven on those roads as I drove from like Sydney to Melbourne. I've done that like a couple of times, and they're like out a little bit like to the west of Melbourne, but it all looks the same. It's like big grasslands, nothing is really going on, there's nobody else on the road. Like, yeah, it's Australia in the 70s.
Yeah, and one of the great things about this movie is it's a lot like a lot of directors' early work where he's doing a lot of guerrilla filmmaking where they would have members of the crew basically block off the road on each end of the road so they can shoot a sequence, but they did not have shooting permits. So they're just blocking off roads so they can shoot like a quick like film sequence. And that's why it's something we noticed when we were watching it, Jason, is that we're not really seeing as many crashes in this movie or like the climax of like any of the action set pieces. They cut away because they couldn't get the roads in order to like shoot those like stunt sequences properly.
Yeah, I think the only one that they did have, like they actually shot the full sequence for is the truck crash. But you can see that there's like a fake barrier on the outside of the truck. Like even I noticed it, and I'm not like a movie buff. I was like, hey, that's a painted like outside of that to hit the bike at the end.
Yeah, so this movie takes place in the near post-apocalypse. It's a world where oil is quickly becoming scarce. That's a plot point that is not mentioned in the first movie, and it's mentioned like immediately in the second movie. And I guess like you could argue like whether or not that's important or not. Mel Gibson plays Max. He is part of, was it the MDF? He's part of like a police unit, one of the last like police units that's in existence, trying to keep the order of the peace. And then there's this like biker gang that is causing them problems. And there's an opening sequence where there's like a chase with a guy and his girlfriend who have stolen like a police vehicle, and they're trying to chase him down. And eventually none of them can get him except for Max, because Max is the coolest. He's badass, and he takes him out. And then Mad Max goes home to his wife and his baby. And it's interesting because, Jason, I don't know if you agree with this, but like this movie is kind of like two different movies. There is the first like hour, which is like all of the police stuff, the police trying to like get the upper hand on this biker gang. And then there's the last 30 minutes, which is Mel Gibson and his wife trying to escape this world. And then it's unsuccessful. Spoilers, his wife and his child get killed. Again, off screen. We don't actually see them. It's like, you see like the bikes going like over the camera, essentially. And then you see like a child's shoe and a toy falling onto the road. And that's to give you the indication that they're dead. And then it just becomes like a basic like revenge film for the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very interesting structure. To me, I think I would have liked it more if like the revenge came in a little earlier, if we didn't spend as much time with like Mel Gibson just being a cop. Because yeah, when you want to see a Mad Max movie, you just kind of want to see Mad Max going around beating people up and being a badass. And I think we commented as we were watching that Mad Max lost like every fight and was completely incompetent until that last 30 minutes. He was not helpful at all.
Yeah, it's a weird like way to depict your hero where he's not that heroic in the movie. They talk about him like he's like the best of these cops. Shout out to, I think his name is Fifi, the police captain guy who we see him in a sweater. I'm sorry, he's got a scarf, no shirt, and leather pants on, which I'm guessing is just the normal thing to wear around in Australia.
Yeah.
A lot of leather in this movie in general. I guess George Miller was just really interested. He must have had a bunch of leather jackets on hand, right? That's the only explanation.
No, that's literally what people were wearing. Like, was trying to like mention that the aesthetic is just like Australia in the 70s. Like everybody has a leather jacket. I have photos of my parents and my grandparents in the same kind of like getup. Like this is the clothing that people wore. This is normal. Not so much the scarf and the leather pants option, but it's not outside of the realm of like the queer communities that we hear and all this kind of things. It's very Australian. I enjoyed it immensely personally, and I think that the pacing is that of an old school film where, you know, the action is the exciting bit at the end. And culturally, Australia hates heroes. If you get too big, you're gonna get hurt, or like the public will turn on you. Nobody likes you. If you're too big, too exciting for any reason, you get tall poppy syndrome. If you get cut down, like that's like a fundamental cultural touchstone for people.
Can you give an example of an Australian hero that got too big?
Mel Gibson.
It's
like a cycle here, and people will be like super popular for a bit, and then if you get too big, then you get your like feet cut out from underneath you, kind of that, like the media turns on you, and it's a real like, I don't like them so much. They're too big. They got too Hollywood. They moved away. Didn't stay Bogan. Like it's.
Do you think that's happening to Margot Robbie?
I don't know. I don't think so, simply because the way that she still interviews pretty humbly. At least the way that it comes across on a lot of this interview stuff. Like, it still comes across as quite humble in the way that she talks, and then Hugh Jackman is a similar one where there's a bit of actually tension now, like around him, and then he left his wife. There, it's like, well, what you gonna do? Like, you're not the good guy anymore. But like, I think it's just, don't get too big, or we don't have you anymore.
Yeah, I was reading that George Miller was looking into possibly getting an American movie star as the star of this film so that it could have like international relevance. And then he eventually changed his mind because he was like, yeah, this is an Australian film at heart. So we need like an Australian actor to like be the lead here.
Yeah.
Is Mel Gibson Australian? I thought he was American.
No, he is.
I saw that he studied, because I had looked this up earlier, that he had studied at in Sydney, which is how he got connected, but I didn't realize he was Australian originally.
He's not Australian. He came here when he was like 17 or something and did like theatre school here. Yeah, and I can hear it, right? When he's talking in the movie, I'm like, American accent. You didn't like, because he can do a really good Australian accent for like parts of it, but I like frequently, I'm like, oh, that's American. I'm
not saying no Australian in case for observers.
For anyone listening,
that was a joke at the beginning. But...
it's really interesting because I was telling you this, Jason, before like we were recording here. The American release of Mad Max, they overdubbed the voice lines to not be Australian accents. They dubbed them over as an American accent, which we listened to this movie with subtitles on because some words in the Australian accent are a little difficult to like parse if you don't have like full volume on.
Like what? Like I'm super curious as to what you didn't catch.
It's tough to say like anything specifically. It almost came off like they were mumbling at times, and so I was stuck like looking at the subtitles more than like looking at their lips when they were talking.
Yeah. Did you guys catch on with Sprague?
I looked it up later.
Yeah, it just means kid, like it's child, offspring, and they called their kid. The whole movie, he doesn't have a name.
That's so Australian.
Oh, really? They named their baby Child?
Yeah.
Sprague means child.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And there's actually some, I realized like after the fact, there's a whole bunch of Australian slang that was like peak 70s that they never used. Like, Uru is a big one to say goodbye and like farewell. And like my dad uses that all the time. And he grew up in basically rural Australia. Both my parents grew up in semi-rural Australia. And he says Uru all the time, like archaic slang like that. Just tend to not see that in the movie at all, but have Sprague in there was really weird to me.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Like how big is Mad Max in Australia? Is it considered like one of like the big like movie franchises for you guys? Like what's its lasting legacy over there?
Is it like Rocky in Philadelphia?
Speaking is Philadelphia.
I guess to some extent there's like a cult hit vibe that goes on with it, mostly because it was so successful for so long. But I think the further away we get as like points of time, the more the more the movies are now shot on like sound stages and like big sets and stuff like that, it kind of like takes away from the cultural touchstones that are in that movie. So like the train station where they go and collect the body and then subsequently like vandalize, that town is like in exactly the same condition, but they've had to upgrade the train station. So there's like bits of the old train station that they've like kept as like a monument to the movie and stuff like that. So I think that's pretty neat, but I don't think
a statue of Mad Max like in the train station crashing a car.
I think it's more likely they'd have the coffin there because that'd be more their vibes.
Yeah.
Cool.
And tourists come and take pictures.
Yeah, because I think this movie is largely shot in Melbourne, right, or Melbourne. Because I was reading that the biker gang in this movie is like an actual biker gang that they just got to drive their actual bikes from Sydney to Melbourne every day that they needed to be shooting. I don't know how long of a drive is that.
Okay, so Sydney to Melbourne is a like at that time it would have been like a 15-hour drive. So now it's down to an 8-hour drive. So they're not coming from Sydney. They might have come from Sydney once, driven to Melbourne, but they're shooting. Most of the shooting locations are like northwest of Melbourne in the more small town kind of region and like farming communities out there. Yeah, it's a bit further away from Melbourne itself. So it's probably like 2 hours, an hour from Melbourne.
Do you know where the desert is that they do like the shooting in like Fury Road and Road Warrior?
Out in Bathurst, isn't it? Only Bathurst or Orange? I think like the big thing is that the first movie is shot in like Victoria, which is one state which is much more south, but that's very wet at the moment. Like it's still very wet. So you have to go to like New South Wales, which is the next state up, to get like the drier, big scenes. And Bathurst is like the last city before the desert that starts, before you go west towards the actual Simpson Desert.
Yeah, because from an American's perspective, Americans just think Australia is a desert wasteland. They think it's actually Mad Max. It's just a documentary.
I mean, it is a little bit like the first one, at least. It's very like, I'm like, oh yeah. See, I know that place. That's real familiar. I've seen that jacket.
One thing I was actually really curious about. There's a sequence near the end of the film where Max's wife, they go to hide away on a farm, and she wants to go to the beach, but she walks like across like a huge field, and then she walks through like a pretty large forest, and then she gets to the beach. Is that like a thing in Australia that there's just like giant forests adjacent to your beaches, then there's farmland?
Most like public beaches are attached to national or state parks, and so that there'll be actual parkland before you get to the beach. Like sometimes you'll be able to drive through, but most of the time there'll be like a forest walk, or there'll be a bit of a reserve right before the beach. It helps protect the sand and the other parts of the actual beach like dynamic. So yeah, there's always a bit of a forest usually before the beach.
Great. Well, that's our geography lesson for everybody there today. Jason, let's talk about Mel Gibson. He is the titular Max in this movie. He's the lead. He's a man that is a little bit problematic nowadays, to say the least.
Yeah, 9 children.
He has 9 children, apparently. Wow, good for him. The man's very fertile. Jason, is Mel Gibson good in this movie?
Not particularly. I mean, he's not given a ton to work with. Like, the Max character is not something that you need, like, a dynamic range for. But yeah, he wasn't, like, memorable to me. He did look cool in a leather jacket, and I think that's the job that he signed up for. So he did that job correctly.
Yeah, it's tough to say, because the Mad Max franchise, despite the fact that the franchise is named after that main character, oftentimes Max is like a lens through which we see the world. More so, the world is the main character of this franchise more than Max. And that's something that really gets fleshed out more in basically every other Mad Max film. It's something the Fury Road does a really good job of, where like Max shows up to this area and then like the plot kind of happens around him.
He is like a very, you guys were talking about like Australian conceptions of heroes. He is a very passive hero. Like he's almost like unwilling in each of the movies to get involved in like other people's like struggles, and ends up getting roped in anyway. And I think we talked about that earlier, and Jason and I talked about that earlier, but I guess I hadn't seen perhaps there's an Australian current of writing there that they don't want their heroes to get too big for their britches.
Yeah, because this movie is basically an origin story for Max, and it's really funny because you go into the second movie and that origin story is like irrelevant. Like they flash back to it briefly, that they're like, oh, he had a wife and child that got killed. And that's like all you need to know from the first movie. You don't even need to watch this first film. And so, you know, if we're talking about this film being like good or not, or being like overrated, underrated, I think that's like an important aspect to like think about, where like this franchise kind of became what it became after the second film, even though this movie made a shitload of money. So, you know, who am I to say?
It's the 70s, so the movie making, movie plot points and all that kind of thing were a bit different. And I think the movie making in Australia was very, very different to movie making in the US or anywhere else. Like we had a somewhat distinct style and distinct sense of humor about some of those weird things that I think happened in the movie. I don't know why you need to specifically talk about the fact that you're eating a peanut butter and honey sandwich, but that was hilarious to me. Like you had a whole dialogue about like what kind of sandwich you're eating. So
that's very relatable. I love a peanut butter and honey sandwich. Jason, I guess we can talk a little bit about George Miller here. Very, very interesting director. If you look at his filmography, Mad Max is obviously his first like feature that he did was Mad Max. And then he did Mad Max 2, which is called The Road Warrior in America. And then he did Mad Max 3, which is called Beyond Thunderdome. He did the Star Wars thing. He made 3 movies in 6 years. He also did one of the vignettes for the Twilight Zone, the movie. He did not do the one that had the helicopter crash where 3 people died. So he was one of the good ones for that. And then his filmography is starting.
He did the Tina Turner music video. Is that the one that was filmed in Philadelphia in Eastern State?
I'm not sure, but Tina Turner is in Beyond Thunderdome. So.
Yeah, I know she's. But there's a Tina Turner music video.
I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up.
Where she was dressed as her Beyond Thunderdome character. So I'm wondering if that's the one.
He directs Babe, Pig in the City.
I love that movie.
And then he follows it up in 2006. So he takes an 8-year break to direct Happy Feet, about a dancing penguin.
Again, another quintessential Australian story.
He follows that up with Happy Feet 2, which comes out 5 years later. And then he has Mad Max Fury Road in 2015. He just throws an absolute fucking haymaker with that movie. We got to at least do like 5 minutes here on Mad Max Fury Road. Is it like the best movie that's come out in the last like 10 years?
It's a contender for sure. I think everyone who sees that movie is like, this is awesome. It's just a pure adrenaline rush. I will say that like Tom Hardy as Mad Max, he does give a performance that is memorable, and you're like, this is cool beyond just a stoic badass man. So yeah, you really see like a lot of growth between that original Mad Max and then Mad Max Fury Road. That's also like how many years later? 40, 45 years later? Yeah.
Yeah, I think George Miller's in his like 70s now, so he's getting up there. I think this is one of those examples of a director, like, he makes a movie early in his career, and he clearly is working low budget. He's working as low budget as he possibly can and trying to make it work. However, like, the vision that he had for that original Mad Max is Mad Max Fury Road. If he had like the money and the resources to do it, he would have made the original Mad Max like Fury Road. So it's cool to see a director like finally have the budget to be able to, you know, make the stuff that he wants to do. But I know like part of the reason why Fury Road took forever to come out was because he couldn't get the financing for that either. It was like $150 million or something to make that film, and it came out great. I mean, kudos to him for like sticking with it, and yeah, it came out amazing. Like I was saying, highest budget film ever shot in Australia. So I don't know what the other contenders are. There's any other big budget films that are shooting in Australia?
I think there's a movie called Australia with Hugh Jackman and Nicole Kidman. Yeah.
And the Matrix movies were shot here. I think is also one of the like big budget films that were shot here. So yeah. Although I can't think of anything else. Like I think they filmed one of the Thor movies here, but the shit one. So I don't know that cost a lot. So one of the shit ones. There's not a lot of.
Yeah. What I was trying to look up, is George Miller the greatest Australian filmmaker of all time?
Baz Luhrmann, I think, would be considered probably one of the greatest filmmakers in Australia.
Yeah, I was looking at some lists.
Yeah, he directed Australia.
Yeah, Baz Luhrmann's up.
He directed a bunch of stuff.
Baz Luhrmann, he directed the '96 Romeo and Juliet. He did Moulin Rouge. He did Australia in 2008. Yes, most recently he did the Elvis film in 2022. Their number one is Peter Weir, who directed Dead Poets Society, The Truman Show, Master Commander.
Oh, well, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I didn't know he was Australian though.
Yeah, there's some other notable, like, more recent filmmakers. James Wan, who is apparently Australian.
I didn't know that. That's crazy.
There's Jennifer Kent, who did The Nightingale and The Babadook.
Oh, wow.
Newer director. Who else we got here?
You got some good talent coming out of there, Iso.
Yeah,
yes,
well,
I did that.
Yeah, good job.
You got to fight off those damn Kiwis over there, because Taika Waititi is producing all the stuff over in New Zealand.
Yeah, look, like, let them have their time in the sun. They'll retreat again. Their industry can't handle like sticking it out. It'll just be another like Lord of the Rings moment, and then they'll just come back to Australia and pretend they're Australian. It'll be fine. Jason,
do you think you would survive in the post-apocalypse where there's dwindling oil and everybody's in leather jackets and needs to drive around like flaming cars to survive?
Do you think you can survive in outback Australia? Because between the mess of the biker gangs at the moment, it's pretty much the same. Like, I don't.
Yeah, that's pretty hard now.
Well, I guess I don't drive now, so not having oil. I guess I do need oil for like other things besides driving, so that would be tough. But Pat and I were Boy Scouts for many years of our lives. I think that basically prepared us for the Australian outback and biker gangs and meth, you said? Yeah, I think we'd be okay.
I also think that this movie, considering the amount of conflict that arises over oils and like petroleum-based transport, I think cycling and pedestrian infrastructure is the future of how to avoid this conflict. So that's my getting up on a pedestal there.
Shout out to environmentalism.
I would not be engaging in these wars because I would be in a nice bike-friendly community where I could just bike around and walk to farmers market.
Isn't the later film also about water, which is like a big deal here?
Fury Road, they're out of water too.
Yeah, it's not just petrol. You have to deal with the water crisis as well.
Okay, I'd die.
And a breedable wimp was also.
Oh yeah, cut that.
Note to the editor, we're gonna get rid of that. All right, before we get into objective rating here, Jason, we're gonna play a little game. This is Two Truths and a Lie. Something we didn't talk about a little bit with the Mad Max films is that because it's a low-budget, successful movie franchise, it spawned a bunch of shitty ripoffs in the 80s. There are just a litany of bad Mad Max ripoffs that are out there in existence, like American ones, Italian ones, Australian ones. Like, everybody's making bad Mad Max ripoffs. Because all you got to do is, like, shoot crap in the desert, right? With, like, cars, with, like, weird, like, outfits. And there's a lot of them, okay? So for Jason and Izzo, I'm going to give you 3 movies. We're going to do 3 rounds here. I'm going to give you 3 movies. 2 of them are Mad Max ripoffs, and 1 of them is not, okay? So you have to spot the lie. Okay, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the first 3 films are called Hell Comes to Frogtown. That's 1. Steel Dawn. And Hawk the Slayer.
Steel Dawn is too concise a name. Everything else is a little bit much. Kind of like Steel Dawn.
I'll go with Hawk the Slayer.
So Jason thinks Hawk the Slayer. Izzo, you think Steel Dawn?
Steel Dawn, yeah.
The correct answer is Hawk the Slayer. Hawk the Slayer is actually a Conan the Barbarian ripoff.
I see.
Okay, so Jason's up 1-0. Round 2. All these movies are word salad. First one is called Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared's Sin. The second one is called The Exterminators of the Year 3000.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one is called Star Chase, The Legend of Orin.
Star Chase? It has sci-fi vibes.
Yeah, I'm going with Exterminators of the Year 3000, but for the same reason.
All right, the correct answer is Star Chase, The Legend of Orin is actually a Star Wars ripoff from the 80s.
I'm back in the game.
So now we're tied 1-1. Comes down to the final round here.
I'm gonna say whatever Rizzo says for this one.
So we're both gonna lose. Excellent.
First movie is called Battle Truck. Second one is called Future Force.
Sorry,
one,
Future Force.
Future Force.
Future Force. Okay.
The third one is called Wheels of Fire. I should note that every movie in this list is an actual movie that exists. I did not make up any names.
I feel like, I don't know, Future Force could be like cop based, which I guess technically Mad Max is like a cop movie, but
yeah, and technically in the future as well.
Yeah, but I feel like they could also like be RoboCop knockoffs. Like,
yeah, I like where your head's at. I'm gonna say the same thing.
Yeah, you're both saying Future Force.
Yeah.
The correct answer is Future Force.
Yes.
Future Force is actually a sci-fi B-movie from the 80s starring David Carradine, where he has a robotic hand that has like superpowers and can like fly around. And yes, it chokes people.
Oh,
very, very
no.
funny. If you know anything about David Carradine's Wikipedia page.
Oh, no.
I don't, so...
Oh, explain it, Dylan.
I'll look it up.
Okay.
Moving on. Anyway, Jason, before we get into overrated, underrated here, we need to first determine what is the objective rating for this film. We're doing scores out of 10. Izzo, feel free to, jump in here. How do you think Mad Max is objectively rated 1 out of 10? If we're to set like a baseline rating here. When you guys think about it, I will say Mad Max, it's 91% Rotten Tomatoes, 73 Metacritic score. It's got really good like critical reviews, and it made a shitload of money.
I would have said like a 7 out of 10. Like, I think that there are some pacing issues, but also movies from the 70s I always feel like have pacing issues, and Australian movies have their own like storytelling vibes. So yeah, I think it's a 7 out of 10. It's very fun. I enjoyed it immensely, mostly for the Australianness of it. So
I could agree with like a 7. I think it does have really high critical ratings now, but at the time this came out, the critics were pretty polarized by it. Reading one of the things just on Wikipedia, an Australian critic actually wrote that this movie has all the emotional uplift of Mein Kampf, which is a crazy thing to say, but also I kind of get where they're coming from. Stephen King called it a turkey, which I guess is like an old-timey insult. So I feel like, you look at the critical reviews from back then and you look at them now, and they kind of average out to be like a 7.
Yeah, I think 7 is pretty fair. We'll go with 7.
I'll go with 6, just to be different.
Thanks, Pat.
I appreciate that.
So why would you rate it so low, Pat? Is it because you hate Australians?
Are we discussing my personal ratings or like
objective?
Because 7 is probably pretty accurate. Like you said, 70s movies are paced weird. I'm just like basing this off of like I'm trying to think of other movies in the 70s, but like drama actions. Like, I don't know, Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver has no action until like the last like 10, 15 minutes. And it's really just like a character study before that. I'm trying to think what other movies. I mentioned already Rocky. I watched Rocky recently, and that movie has weird pacing issues. Like, movies are just paced very differently nowadays. But no, 7.
Sure.
Yes, I got it on side.
All right, let's lock it in. 7.
And I'm also biased by the fact that it's listed as 7 out of 10.
All right, so Jason, now that we have our objective rating, it is your job to argue that Mad Max is overrated. What is your argument?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, when you just asked for my general opinions, I think this movie suffers from like pacing issues. I think you can try and explain away that the 70s were a different time, but like a lot of good movies came out in the 70s. The Godfather, which Dylan hasn't seen.
Never heard of it.
Star Wars came out like in 77. That movie is structured very classically and is great. You know, the main thing that I think this movie has going for it is the cool, like, riding in cars and wearing leather jackets, which is great. But I think you can get that in other places, too. It seems like this is, like, a franchise that's largely defined by the movies that came after this first one. This first one only set up the rest of the franchise insofar as it made money. I think you could just cut this from the roster and you would not realize that it's gone. Basically, this feels like an attempt at like a 70s exploitation revenge film, like The Last House on the Left or The Hills Have Eyes. It feels like it wants to be like a 70s horror film, but they didn't have the budget for like the blood and gore and actual like ability to commit to like really going all out with that. But there were other films doing stuff like this that did it better. Yeah, I just think that performances weren't like particularly memorable. I guess even the world building, which I complimented earlier, and I was like, the aesthetic is cool. Apparently, that's just what Australia looks like. So I can't even give you credit for that.
We can't give the movie credit. It's just Australia.
I mean, good on George Miller for sticking to his guns and being like, I want to make an Australian movie. I want this to be a reflection of my home. I respect that, but I can't give him any credit for like crafting the scenery if you're just telling me that that's just what Australia looked like.
It still kind of looks like, so.
I'm so sorry. It looks like a dystopian future. That's terrible.
It's fine. Everyone here is fine. Mostly.
It's fine.
There's a bit of a mental problem, but it's fine.
There's elements of Philadelphia that probably have the same aesthetic. But yeah, that's it.
So I have the underrated argument for Mad Max. And while I will agree that the later installments of the franchise is really what people remember the franchise for, the franchise doesn't happen without the first movie. And not only that, like you said, the movie's got to make money. This film was the like highest grossing film for the lowest budget ever for 20 years. It was eventually dethroned by the Blair Witch Project in 1999, which I think was eventually dethroned by Paranormal Activity. And a lot of the times, movies that you see that make a lot of money on very low budgets tend to come from like horror or genres where you can basically shoot the entire film in like a building or something like that. Keep it really low budget. You don't have a lot of actors. You don't have a lot of crew like running around. It's not movies like Mad Max where George Miller shot this on a shitload of different locations. They were shooting it on random roads in Australia that they did not have permits for. And they had like, you know, souped up cars that they had to make like look cool, and they were crashing cars. And it's like the lowest budget good action movie ever made. And not only that, it spawned like a shitload of other movies that take Mad Max as their inspiration. Any movie that has a car chase has Mad Max to look back on as like one of its like original inspirations. I think of a movie like Speed, the Keanu Reeves movie. like is just directly like coming off of like Mad Max and its inspiration. So while I will agree that, you know, the movie on itself, I honestly didn't like it that much, but you cannot discount the legacy that this film has, not only with the other Mad Max films, but with like filmmaking writ large. And also, yeah, it just, Mad Max references are everywhere, and like TV and media. I think that just can't be understated. $100 million in 1979 for a low budget film like that is absolutely absurd. I mean, there are so many examples of low budget filmmakers throughout history, like trying to do exactly what George Miller did with this film, and you just don't hear about them because they weren't successful. They didn't make any money. They just like fell on their face. The fact that like this movie specifically is like able to break through, like he's the 1% of the 1% that was able to get this movie done, and then he was able to make like an entire career out of that, is like absolutely absurd. So I don't know, Isa, you can hop in here. Which side do you think you fall on for Mad Max, underrated or overrated?
Like I don't know, actually, because I do think that like there's a case to be made that this series is, you don't need the first one, but again, you don't get the funding for the second one if you've never made the first one. I think that there are a lot of cultural touchstones within the first movie that are never gonna be noticed by you guys. That they're not cultural touchstones for you because they're not part of the life that you or your parents have ever lived, right? But I have immensely enjoyed all of the cultural touchstones that were in that film and stuff that I see all the time. And so like I enjoy it for those aspects, and I can still kind of like enjoy the meandering pace because of it's showing me bits of my lifestyle that my family leads and all those kind of things that I see, which, you know, I enjoy immensely. But again, it's not a mass market appeal thing. So I can see that being like a detraction for anybody who's not watching it and being like, hey, that's outside my house, or like that's the road to here, and like here's a discussion about a sandwich that I think everybody in my family has had, or like naming your child Sprague because you don't have you don't refer to your children by their actual name, or you don't refer to any of your friends by their actual name. It's all about a nickname. Like, you know, everybody has the like what are they actually called in the story versus like what their actual names are. And I don't know if you guys noticed that they don't call them what their full names are in any of those scenes. They're all variations of their name, and nobody addresses that whatsoever. And then, yeah, it's stuff like that I really enjoy. I feel like they probably didn't go as hard into the slang and the way that people actually speak. It's actually clearer. I know that you didn't notice that, but I think they speak clearer than a lot of the people did at the time. Like, there's a lot of very heavy and very broad accents that would have been in those regions, but they don't speak like that. And also the haircuts are way cleaner than any of the haircuts in any of those places now or at the time. Like, everybody's a little bit too clean, which is just very like, oh, this is a movie because of those things. So I don't know. I think I enjoyed it immensely. So I think that it's like, I think it's hyped enough. I think it's exactly where it needs to be. I think it's a great film, but I can also see cases for both other sides.
What do you think our other Australian, Patrick?
Oh, yeah.
No, I would say I feel like the strength of the Mad Max franchise is that every movie is completely different from the other one. So I would say underrated, I guess, in that case. I do think like this one is much more of a character study, and I think like the details of Max's backstory are really kind of irrelevant in later ones, but I think that's kind of plays to the strength of the entire franchise, is that like, you know, it creates a world where they can tell these different stories, and each one is very different, like whether it's an action, whether it's like a weird post-apocalyptic thing, whether it's like a character study and revenge story. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of the franchise as a whole, so I think this is a solid starting point for it.
Yeah, I guess we can get into the verdict here a little bit. I think ultimately the legacy of this first film, a lot of it hinges on the fact that Fury Road got made, and the Fury Road is as good as it is. If Mad Max Fury Road doesn't exist, I think we're having like a whole different conversation around these first three Mad Max films.
I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
I think like George Miller and Mel Gibson, as controversial as he is, have both like gone on to have extremely successful careers, and this was the start of both of their careers. So even if like Fury Road was not super popular, then I think you could still say that Mad Max was like an important franchise in movie history, at least modern movie history.
Yeah, absolutely. If nothing else, because it influenced so many other films. I mean, oftentimes, we've talked about this in other pods, Jason, that like movies that are known for influencing other movies tend to not be like the best films on their own, because it's just like elements that other movies are taking to and they're taking those like base ideas and finding them into other stories. So the fact that George Miller is able to do this for his first movie ever is it's really impressive.
I'm sticking with my original opinion that I think this movie is overrated, especially like with a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. A lot of people view this in like the same realm as like Star Wars and like other massive franchises, and I just don't think this movie is that good. It was a fine movie, like you said. I gave it 3 stars on Letterboxd. That's good. That's what I give like the less good Fast and Furious movies.
Oh no. Let me bring out Fast and the Furious. Oh no.
I will say that Fast and Furious, it is definitely a descendant of...
Both of them are films about family. Can't confirm.
Yeah. Fast and Furious is definitely a descendant of this film and this franchise. So I guess we have Mad Max to thank for that, but I don't like those movies that much.
I will say, you have not seen Road Warrior yet.
Yeah, we're about to watch it, right?
Yeah, I think we're going to watch it tonight. So,
all right. If I change my mind after watching Road Warrior, Izzo, I'll call you and I'll apologize.
Yeah, we'll put a little editor's note at the bottom of the episode here.
Yeah, we'll record that phone call.
Are you guys looking forward to seeing the Furiosa movie?
Yeah.
I don't know, to be honest. Yeah, I think it could be really interesting, and I think it could be exciting to see the action set pieces from that, but I am somewhat hesitant to watch like current modern movies because I've been let down too many times. So
what are some movies that have disappointed you lately?
Like The Fall Guy, I was like looking for that to be like super like stunt driven and all these kind of things, and then I know that they did the stunts and then they like polished it so high that it doesn't look real, like there are no stakes anymore. That's just a weird, for me, that was like a weird choice, given that like you put all this effort to go and do these like incredible stunts, and they show you at the end the backstage footage of them doing that, and it's just like, but you did that. Why does it look fake in the movie?
Yeah, I haven't seen The Fall Guy. That came out like literally this weekend, yeah. I think.
It came out here earlier than anywhere else, and it was like, what is going on?
You guys got soon first too.
For the US.
Good for you.
Yeah, it's like Pat, you were saying that like every movie in the Mad Max franchise is like a little bit different than the other ones. So yeah. I'm curious to see, like, is Furiosa just another Fury Road movie, or is there some other direction that he's going to take this that we haven't seen from like another film in the franchise? Because I'm assuming that they're just going to take the Furiosa character and kind of like make her into the Max character. They're doing a Max story with a different protagonist. So
kind of hoping that's not the case. Yeah, I'm kind of hoping that's not the case. And I feel like the Mad Max movies have never been overly burdened by plot. Which again is to its advantage, I think. I don't know. I'm hoping they do something different with it. I'm excited to see it. So
yeah, that comes out. Well, it'll be out the week that we're releasing this podcast, but we'll definitely see it opening week. I'm excited to see it. It was in your top 5 list, wasn't it, Jason?
Yeah, I think it might have been number 1.
It was number 1 over Dune.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. I think the feedback from the Fury Road was that Max kind of met another character that was equally as like strong and standoffish as him within the story. So it was like this environment is creating these kind of people that then have to butt up against each other. But if they just tell the same backstory, I think it will detract somewhat from the Fury Road stuff. You're like, oh, it's just the same person, just reincarnated differently. Like, whereas like you kind of want someone to have a different path to end up at the same place.
It would be funny if the Furiosa movie is basically the first Mad Max film all over again. Like it's just shot in like random buildings in Australia.
Just random roads.
Just random roads.
I honestly think I would be more entertained by that if it turned out to be like almost a shot-for-shot remake of the film that nobody in our generation has seen in regards to the Mad Max franchise. And they're just doing a big loop. They're just doing it again.
Yeah, but I think that's going to do it for our Mad Max Over Under podcast here. Jason, Patrick, Thanks for hopping on. Izzo, our special guest from halfway around the world. We're shooting this on a Saturday night, but it is not Saturday night for you. It's the middle of the day on Sunday.
Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. Yeah, but I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking about Mad Max with us. Definitely have to have you on another pod here.
Yeah. I mean, if you guys ever get around to watching The Castle, another cultural touchstone of Australia, and see that's one you can have me on for.
Sounds great.
Put it on the list.
Watch that movie.
Do you have anything you want to plug for the podcast?
Yeah. So when we have time, we are playing D&D on Twitch. We are at Roll for Dopamine on Twitch and Instagram. And if you like gym-based content, I guess you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Isobel7862. I should fix that. But yeah.
We'll have all the links in the description of this podcast. Check them out. You can also follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Pods, anywhere you get your podcasts. We are also on YouTube. This is also a video podcast. We release episodes every Monday. However, if you're one of our Patreons, you get the podcast on Sundays. So you get a whole 24 hours early, and you also get your name at the end credits of every episode. You can also check us out on Twitter, TikTok, if you want to see like our little short snippets of podcasts that we put out. We're trying to do outreach. We really got to get on the TikToks. I know, Jason, we've been talking about this for a while. We got to get on the TikToks more.
It's going to be banned soon.
It's true. It's about to be banned in America.
We got to get on the YouTube shorts.
Yeah, it'll be on
We
YouTube.
will probably follow you guys into the TikTok ban. That's kind of how it works here. So
Looking forward to
we'll be
it.
3 months behind, but we'll lose it too.
Beautiful.
Good.
Anyway, for myself, for Jason, for Patrick, for Izzo, that's going to do it for this episode of the Over Under Movies podcast. We will see you at the movies. Peace out, guys. We're done.
No.
You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
We're good.
Good job, everyone.